They say a mother's love knows no bounds, but sometimes those bounds need to exist for everyone's sake. My name is Catherine Martinez, and for 31 years I believed that constant vigilance and endless worry were the hallmarks of good motherhood. I thought that anticipating every problem, solving every crisis, and shielding my son from every consequence was what love looked like. I was devastatingly wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The moment I realized my worry had become a weapon turned against me wasn't when my son Marcus rolled his eyes at my concern about his reckless driving. It wasn't when he snapped at me for asking if he'd eaten lunch. It was when he looked at me with genuine disgust and said, "Mom, you're always worrying about everything. It's exhausting being around you. No wonder Dad left." Those words didn't just sting. They shattered something fundamental inside me that I didn't even know could break. Standing there in my kitchen in Riverside, California, surrounded by the remnants of the lunch I'd prepared for him that he hadn't bothered to touch, I felt 31 years of maternal devotion crumble into dust. After everything I had sacrificed, after every sleepless night spent anxious about his well-being, after every dollar stretched to ensure he had what he needed, my 29-year-old son had just dismissed my love as an inconvenience. What happened next changed both our lives forever, though neither of us could have predicted the path we were about to walk. I never imagined that my story would become one of boundaries, betrayal, and ultimately, the most painful kind of growth. My journey as Marcus's mother began in the summer of 1994, when I was barely 22, and still believed that love could conquer any obstacle. I had met his father, Roberto, during my junior year at UC Riverside, where I was studying elementary education with dreams of teaching kindergarten. Roberto was charming, ambitious, and completely unprepared for the responsibility that came with an unplanned pregnancy. When I told him about the baby, his first words were, "Are you sure you want to keep it?" The question broke my heart, but it also steeled my resolve. I knew from that moment that this child would be mine to raise, mine to protect, mine to worry about. Roberto stuck around for the first 3 years of Marcus's life, but his presence was sporadic at best, his support inconsistent, and his patience with fatherhood practically non-existent. The night Roberto walked out for the final time, Marcus was crying from an ear infection. I was exhausted from working 2 part-time jobs while finishing my teaching degree, and our tiny apartment felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Roberto threw his hands up in frustration and declared, "I can't do this anymore, Kat. You worry about every little thing. The kid cries, you panic. He coughs, you think he's dying. It's too much." As I watched him pack his few belongings, bouncing, a feverish Marcus in my arms, I made a silent vow. I would never let my son feel abandoned the way Roberto was abandoning us. I would be everything this child needed: mother, father, protector, provider. I would worry enough for both parents, anticipate every need, prevent every hurt. That vow shaped the next 26 years of our lives in ways I never could have imagined. After Roberto left, I threw myself into creating the perfect life for Marcus. I finished my education degree while working nights at a diner, studying, during Marcus's naps and after his bedtime. When I finally landed my first teaching position at Hillcrest Elementary, I felt like I had conquered the world. Here was stable income, health insurance, and a schedule that would allow me to be present for my son. But being present became being everywhere, all the time. When Marcus started preschool, I was the parent who called to check on him during lunch. When he began playing Little League, I was the mother on the sidelines with a first aid kit, sunscreen, extra water, and backup snacks. Other parents would joke about Mama Martinez and her magic bag, but I took pride in being prepared for every possibility. Marcus was a bright child, curious and energetic, but he was also prone to taking risks that made my heart race. He would climb trees that seemed too tall, ride his bike too fast down steep hills, befriend children whose parents I worried were bad influences. My response was always the same: vigilant supervision, gentle redirection, and when necessary, firm restrictions, designed to keep him safe. When Marcus was 8, he broke his arm falling from the monkey bars at school. I received the call during my lunch break and raced to the school so fast I got a speeding ticket. Seeing him in the nurse's office, pale and frightened, confirmed every maternal instinct I'd ever had. The world was dangerous, and my job was to stand between that danger and my child. From that day forward, I implemented what I called my worry system. I would walk through potential scenarios in my mind, identify risks, and create preventive measures. If Marcus was going to a friend's house, I needed the parents' phone numbers, their address, a detailed itinerary, and check-in times. If he was riding his bike, he needed a helmet, knee pads, and couldn't go beyond our street. If he was trying a new activity, I researched every possible safety concern and came prepared. My fellow teachers would sometimes comment on how attentive I was to Marcus's needs. "You're such a dedicated mother, Catherine," they would say. "That boy is lucky to have someone who cares so much." Their validation felt good, confirming that my constant vigilance was not neurosis, but love in action. As Marcus entered middle school, my worry evolved to match new challenges. Now I was concerned about academic pressure, social dynamics, and the influence of older students. I volunteered for every field trip, joined the PTA, and made sure I knew the parents of every child in Marcus's social circle. When he started showing interest in skateboarding, I researched the activity extensively, bought him professional-grade protective gear, and found the safest skate park in our area. Marcus would sometimes complain about my involvement, but I interpreted his protests as typical adolescent desire for independence rather than genuine frustration with my parenting style. "Mom, you don't have to come to everything," he would say when I volunteered to chaperone another school dance. "I know I don't have to," I would respond. "I want to. I like being part of your life." High school brought new worries that felt more intense and consequential. There were concerns about drinking, drugs, inappropriate relationships, college preparation, and the looming specter of adulthood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I responded by increasing my involvement and vigilance. I knew Marcus's class schedule better than he did, maintained relationships with all his teachers, and kept detailed records of his academic progress. When Marcus got his driver's license, at 16, I spent weeks researching the safest vehicles, reading accident statistics, and developing a comprehensive set of driving rules. He could only drive during daylight hours, couldn't have passengers for the first 6 months, and had to text me when he arrived at any destination. I also installed a GPS tracking app on his phone, which he protested but eventually accepted as just another one of Mom's worry things. My worry extended beyond Marcus's immediate safety to his long-term success and happiness. I researched colleges starting his sophomore year, helped him develop an extracurricular portfolio, and spent countless hours editing his college application essays. When he expressed interest in studying business, I connected him with successful entrepreneurs in our community and arranged informational interviews. Marcus was accepted to several universities, ultimately choosing to attend UC San Diego for their business program. As his departure date approached, I felt simultaneously proud of his achievement and terrified of the reduced oversight I would have over his daily life. I spent the summer before his freshman year researching campus safety, creating care packages, and developing communication schedules that would keep us connected without being intrusive. College years were challenging for my worry system. Marcus was 3 hours away, living in an environment I couldn't control or monitor directly. I adapted by maintaining regular contact through texts, calls, and video chats. I sent care packages monthly, visited for parents' weekends, and stayed informed about campus events and policies. When Marcus mentioned struggling with a particularly difficult economics course, I hired a tutor without being asked. When he complained about the quality of dorm food, I arranged for a meal delivery service. Marcus graduated with honors in business administration, an achievement I celebrated as validation of our partnership in his success. My worry, my vigilance, my constant support had helped produce an intelligent, capable young man ready to take on the world. I felt vindicated in every late night spent helping with homework, every social event I had vetted, every safety precaution I had implemented. After graduation, Marcus moved back to Riverside while he looked for work, and I was so thrilled to have him home again. But something had changed during his college years. The appreciation he had sometimes shown for my involvement had been replaced by irritation and impatience. He would sigh heavily when I asked about his job interviews, roll his eyes when I suggested networking opportunities, and snap at me when I offered advice about apartment hunting. I told myself this was normal post-graduation stress, the natural friction of an adult child learning to navigate independence while still living at home. I adjusted my approach, trying to be supportive without being overbearing, helpful without being controlling. But the tension between us continued to grow. Marcus eventually found a position with a marketing firm in downtown Riverside, and I helped him secure an apartment in a safe neighborhood close to his workplace. I researched the area thoroughly, checking crime statistics, reviewing the building's security features, and even meeting with the landlord to ensure Marcus would be in good hands. When moving day arrived, I coordinated the entire process, hired professional movers, and spent the weekend helping him settle in. For the first few months, our relationship seemed to stabilize. Marcus would call periodically, visit for Sunday dinners, and occasionally ask for advice or support. I began to relax slightly, thinking we had successfully navigated the transition from my being his primary caregiver to becoming a supportive presence in his adult life. But then the criticisms began in earnest. It started with small comments about my tendency to overthink things and my need to be involved in everything. Marcus would make jokes about my worry gene and suggest that I needed to learn to relax. I tried to take these comments in stride, even agreeing that perhaps I could be less anxious about things outside my control. The criticism escalated. When Marcus started dating Emma, a confident young woman who worked in his office, Emma was friendly enough when I met her, but I sensed a certain judgment in her interactions with me. She would raise her eyebrows when I asked Marcus about his recent doctor's appointment, or when I mentioned the emergency kit I kept in my car. During one Sunday dinner, I overheard her whisper to Marcus, "Does she always ask this many questions?" Marcus began declining my invitations more frequently, canceling our lunch dates at the last minute, and responding to my texts with increasingly short replies. When I expressed concern about this change in our relationship, he told me I was being dramatic and reading too much into things. He assured me nothing was wrong, that he was just busy with work and his new relationship. The pattern continued for months. I would reach out with care and concern, and Marcus would respond with annoyance and dismissal. I began second-guessing my every interaction with him, wondering if my expressions of love and interest were somehow inappropriate or excessive. I started pulling back, giving him more space, but this seemed to create a different kind of distance between us. One evening in early spring, I called Marcus because I hadn't heard from him in over a week. When he answered, he sounded distracted and irritated. I asked if he was feeling all right, mentioned that I hadn't seen him at Sunday dinner in 3 weeks, and wondered if he wanted to grab lunch later that week. His response was cold and cutting. "Mom, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You're always checking up on me, always wanting to know what I'm doing and how I'm feeling. It's suffocating. I'm 29 years old. I don't need you to monitor my life anymore." I tried to explain that I wasn't monitoring him, that I was simply interested in maintaining our relationship and ensuring his well-being. But Marcus interrupted me with a sigh that conveyed years of accumulated frustration. "You don't understand," he said. "Emma's mom calls her maybe once a week, asks how she's doing, and that's it. Normal mothers don't need constant updates on their adult children's lives. Normal mothers don't worry about every little thing." The word normal hit me like a physical blow. Was I abnormal? Had my love and concern somehow become distorted into something unhealthy? I hung up the phone feeling confused and hurt, wondering if I had been deluding myself about the nature of our relationship. Over the following weeks, I tried to implement what I thought Marcus wanted. I reduced my calls to once a week, stopped asking detailed questions about his life, and gave him space to reach out to me rather than initiating contact myself. But this approach seemed to create even more distance between us. Our conversations became stilted and superficial, lacking the warmth and connection that had once characterized our relationship. Marcus's behavior during this period was confusing and hurtful. He would sometimes be warm and engaging, reminiscent of the closeness we had once shared. But more often he was distant, distracted, and quick to interpret my concern as criticism or interference. I began to feel like I was walking on eggshells around my own son, carefully measuring every word to avoid triggering his irritation. The situation came to a head on a Saturday in late April. I had been feeling particularly lonely and disconnected from Marcus, so I decided to surprise him with his favorite meal: homemade enchiladas with the special sauce recipe that had been his childhood comfort food. I spent the morning shopping for ingredients, preparing the elaborate dish, and setting my dining table with care. When Marcus arrived, responding to my text invitation with a reluctant agreement to join me for lunch, he seemed tired and stressed. I tried to create a warm, welcoming atmosphere, asking gentle questions about his work and his relationship with Emma. But my attempts at conversation were met with monosyllabic responses and visible impatience. As we sat at the table, Marcus barely touched the food I had spent hours preparing. When I asked if something was wrong with the enchiladas, if I had prepared them differently than usual, he set down his fork and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of frustration, exhaustion, and something that looked uncomfortably like contempt. "Mom," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "this is exactly what I mean. You make this elaborate meal, you set the table like it's some special occasion, you ask 100 questions, and then you worry when I'm not reacting the way you want me to. It's exhausting being around you." I felt my face flush with embarrassment and hurt. I tried to explain that I had simply wanted to spend time with him, that I missed our connection, that the meal was a gesture of love rather than expectation. But Marcus was no longer listening. He was building to something, gathering momentum for words that would change everything between us. "You're always worrying about everything," he continued, his voice growing louder and more harsh. "You worry about my job, my apartment, my relationship, my health, what I eat, where I go, who I spend time with. You worry about things that haven't even happened yet. It's like you can't just let me live my life without constantly anticipating problems that don't exist." I sat in stunned silence as Marcus continued his verbal assault on everything I had believed about our relationship and my role as his mother. Each word felt like a deliberate strike against the foundation of my identity, attacking not just my actions, but my fundamental understanding of love and care. "Emma says her friends think it's weird how much you're involved in my life," he said, delivering what felt like the ultimate judgment. "Normal mothers don't need to know every detail of their adult children's lives. Normal mothers don't create drama where none exists. Normal mothers don't make their kids feel guilty for having independence." The reference to Emma and her friends discussing my relationship with Marcus felt like a betrayal beyond the immediate hurt of his words. I realized that I had become a subject of analysis and criticism among people who didn't know me, who had never witnessed the years of love and sacrifice that had defined my motherhood. But Marcus wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, looking at the untouched enchiladas and the carefully set table, and delivered the words that would echo in my mind for months to come. "Mom, you're always worrying about everything. It's exhausting being around you." No wonder Dad left. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus seemed to realize immediately that he had crossed a line, that he had weaponized my deepest insecurity and greatest fear. But the words were out, hanging in the air between us like poison gas, contaminating everything they touched. I felt something inside me shift and harden in that moment. Not just hurt, though the pain was overwhelming, but a kind of cold clarity that I had never experienced before. For 31 years, I had defined myself through my worry for Marcus, my vigilance for his well-being, my willingness to sacrifice my own needs for his benefit. And now, that very love was being characterized as the reason his father had abandoned us both. Marcus must have seen something change in my expression because he immediately began backtracking, claiming he hadn't meant what he said, that he was just frustrated and stressed about work. But I was no longer listening to his explanations. I was seeing our entire relationship with new eyes, recognizing patterns I had been blind to for years. How many times had Marcus allowed me to solve problems he could have handled himself? How many times had he accepted my help, my money, my time, and my worry without offering gratitude or reciprocation? How many times had he taken my love for granted while characterizing it as a burden rather than a gift? I stood up from the table slowly, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. Marcus was still talking, still trying to soften the impact of his words, but I was done listening. For the first time in his life, I was done worrying about managing his emotions or protecting him from the consequences of his choices. "I think you should leave," I said quietly, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. Marcus looked genuinely surprised, as if the possibility that I might have limits had never occurred to him. "Mom, come on, don't be dramatic. I didn't mean it like that. I'm just stressed about work and—" "I'm not being dramatic," I interrupted, something I had rarely done in all our years together. "I'm being clear. You're exhausted by being around me, and I'm apparently abnormal in my concern for your well-being. So perhaps it would be better if you spent less time around me." Marcus stared at me for a long moment, clearly expecting me to soften, to apologize, to return to my familiar role of smoothing over conflict and managing his comfort. When I remained standing silently by the table, he seemed to realize that something fundamental had shifted. "Fine," he said, standing up and grabbing his jacket. "I'll call you when you're ready to have a rational conversation about this." As I watched him leave, I felt a strange combination of heartbreak and relief. The constant anxiety that had been my companion for 3 decades suddenly felt different, not absent, but redirected. Instead of worrying about Marcus's well-being, I found myself wondering about my own. That night, I sat in my living room, surrounded by the artifacts of 31 years of devoted motherhood. Photo albums documenting every milestone, awards and certificates I had helped him earn, thank you cards from teachers praising my involvement in his education. Each item felt like evidence in a case I was no longer sure I wanted to win. I began to think about the women in my life who had different relationships with their adult children. My colleague Sarah, whose daughter called once a week and visited monthly, but who lived her own independent life without constant maternal oversight. My neighbor Helen, whose son lived across the country and maintained a warm but appropriately distant relationship with his parents. My sister Maria, whose children sought her advice occasionally but didn't expect her to solve their problems or anticipate their needs. Were these women neglectful mothers? Were they missing some crucial element of parental love? Or had they managed to navigate the transition from active parenting to supportive presence in a way that I had failed to achieve? For the first time, I began to question whether my worry had really been about Marcus's well-being or about my own need to feel essential, valuable, and needed. Had I created a dynamic where his dependence on my concern was actually serving my psychological needs rather than his practical ones? The questions kept me awake that night and haunted me in the days that followed. Marcus didn't call, and for the first time in years, I didn't reach out to him either. The silence between us felt both terrifying and liberating, creating space for reflection I hadn't allowed myself in decades. As the days turned into weeks, I began to notice things about my life that my constant focus on Marcus had obscured. I realized I had few close friendships, partly because I had always prioritized my availability for Marcus over social commitments. I had hobbies and interests that I had abandoned or diminished because they took time away from my worry and vigilance. Most importantly, I began to recognize that my identity had become so intertwined with being Marcus's mother that I had lost touch with who Catherine Martinez was as an individual. My worries, my energy, my emotional bandwidth had all been dedicated to someone who had now explicitly stated that my care was unwelcome and burdensome. The realization was both devastating and strangely freeing. If Marcus found my concern exhausting, if my love felt like suffocation rather than support, then perhaps it was time to redirect that energy towards someone who might actually appreciate it, myself. 3 weeks passed in an unprecedented silence between Marcus and me. For the first time since his birth, I wasn't tracking his daily activities, anticipating his needs, or mentally rehearsing solutions to problems he might encounter. The absence of that constant mental background noise was initially unsettling, like suddenly noticing the hum of an air conditioner only after it stops running. During those first days of our separation, I found myself reaching for my phone dozens of times, wanting to text Marcus about everything from weather warnings to traffic alerts to reminders about upcoming appointments. Each time, I would catch myself and deliberately set the phone aside, forcing myself to sit with the discomfort of not knowing how he was managing without my guidance. The hardest part wasn't the worry itself, which had been my constant companion for decades, but the way its absence revealed how empty my daily routine had become. Without Marcus's life to organize, monitor, and optimize, my own days felt strangely shapeless. I would finish my teaching responsibilities, return home, and find myself wandering through rooms that suddenly seemed too quiet, too still. On the fourth day of our silence, I received a text from Marcus that simply read, "Are you going to keep acting like this?" The message irritated me more than it hurt, though I couldn't immediately articulate why. After staring at it for several minutes, I realized what bothered me most was the implicit assumption that my withdrawal was temporary dramatics, rather than a genuine response to his rejection of my care. I didn't respond to the text, which seemed to surprise Marcus more than any lengthy explanation could have. By the end of that week, he had sent 3 more messages, each slightly more conciliatory than the last, but all maintaining the underlying premise that I was overreacting to a minor disagreement rather than processing a fundamental reevaluation of our relationship. The breakthrough in my understanding came during a conversation with my colleague Diana, a fellow 4th-grade teacher who had become a trusted friend over the years. We were eating lunch in the faculty room when she noticed my distraction and asked if everything was all right. "I'm having some difficulties with Marcus," I admitted, then found myself telling her about our recent confrontation and the weeks of silence that had followed. Diana listened thoughtfully, asking occasional clarifying questions, but mostly allowing me to articulate my confusion and hurt without interruption. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Catherine," she said gently, "can I ask you something that might be difficult to hear?" I nodded, though my stomach tightened with apprehension. "Do you think it's possible that Marcus has a point about the intensity of your involvement in his life, even if he expressed it cruelly?" The question stung, but I forced myself to consider it honestly. "I don't know," I admitted. "I always thought I was just being a good mother, being present and supportive." Diana nodded understandingly. "I'm sure that was your intention, but sometimes our best intentions can create unintended consequences," especially when they're driven by our own anxieties rather than our children's actual needs. She paused, then continued carefully. My daughter Rebecca is about Marcus's age, and we went through a similar period when I had to learn to step back. It was incredibly difficult, but ultimately it improved our relationship. What do you mean by stepping back? I asked. Well, Diana said, I had to examine whether my involvement in Rebecca's life was actually helping her develop independence and confidence, or whether it was communicating that I didn't trust her to handle things on her own. The conversation with Diana planted a seed of uncomfortable self-reflection that continued to grow over the following days. I began to examine my interactions with Marcus through a different lens, asking myself whether my worry and vigilance had actually undermined his confidence rather than supporting it. I remembered moments throughout his childhood and adolescence when Marcus had seemed capable of handling situations that I had immediately stepped in to manage. The science project, in 8th grade, that he had wanted to approach creatively, but I had guided him toward a more traditional presentation to ensure a good grade. The college application process, where I had researched schools and strategies so thoroughly that Marcus had commented he felt like a passenger in his own future. More recently, I recalled instances where Marcus had mentioned work challenges or personal decisions, and I had immediately offered advice, suggestions, and solutions, rather than simply listening and expressing confidence in his ability to navigate the situation himself. Had I been so focused on protecting him from failure and difficulty that I had inadvertently communicated doubt about his competence? The realization was painful but increasingly unavoidable. My worry system, which I had constructed as an expression of love and protection, might have actually been a mechanism of control that diminished Marcus's sense of agency and independence. A month after our confrontation, I decided to take a step that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. I enrolled in a counseling program through my health insurance, specifically seeking support for understanding healthy boundaries in adult parent-child relationships. Dr. Patricia Hernandez was a family therapist in her 50s who specialized in helping parents navigate the transition from active caregiving to supportive presence as their children moved into adulthood. During our first session, she asked me to describe my relationship with Marcus and my concerns about our recent conflict. As I recounted the history of our relationship, Dr. Hernandez took notes and asked probing questions that helped me see patterns I had never recognized. She pointed out how my language consistently framed Marcus as someone who needed protection and guidance rather than as a capable adult managing his own life. "Catherine," she said during our third session, "I'd like you to consider the possibility that your worry serves multiple functions beyond protecting Marcus. Sometimes anxiety about our children can be a way of maintaining connection and feeling needed, especially when we're unsure of our value in their lives as independent adults." The observation hit uncomfortably close to home. I had always prided myself on being indispensable to Marcus, on being the person he could count on to anticipate problems and provide solutions. Without that role, what was my identity as his mother? Dr. Hernandez helped me understand that healthy parent-adult-child relationships require a fundamental shift from managing and directing to trusting and supporting. This transition is particularly challenging for single parents who have shouldered all responsibility for their children's well-being, making it difficult to recognize when that level of involvement is no longer appropriate or helpful. The goal, she explained, isn't to stop caring about Marcus or to become disconnected from his life. It's to trust that you've given him the tools he needs to navigate adulthood and to demonstrate that trust through your behavior. Over the weeks that followed, I began implementing small changes in my daily routine and mental habits. Instead of mentally rehearsing potential problems Marcus might encounter each day, I practiced redirecting that energy toward my own goals and interests. Instead of checking his social media to monitor his activities and mood, I focused on engaging with my own social connections. The process was more difficult than I had anticipated. Anxiety that had been directed outward toward Marcus began turning inward, manifesting as worry about whether I was becoming a neglectful parent, whether Marcus was struggling without my support, whether our relationship would ever recover from the damage of our recent conflict. Dr. Hernandez helped me recognize these concerns as normal parts of the adjustment process. Learning to trust your adult child's competence requires grieving. The loss of your role as primary caregiver, she explained. That grief is real and valid, even though the transition is healthy and necessary. 2 months after our confrontation, I received a phone call from Marcus that caught me completely off guard. His voice sounded strained and uncertain, lacking the confidence and irritation that had characterized our recent interactions. "Mom," he said, "I need to talk to you about something important. Can we meet for coffee tomorrow?" My first instinct was to bombard him with questions about what was wrong, whether he was all right, whether he needed immediate help. But I caught myself, drawing on the techniques Dr. Hernandez had taught me for managing my anxiety without transferring it to Marcus. "Of course," I said simply. "What time works for you?" We agreed to meet at a cafe near his office the following afternoon. I spent the intervening hours practicing the mindfulness techniques I had learned to manage my speculation and worry about what Marcus might want to discuss. Instead of creating elaborate scenarios in my mind, I focused on staying present and trusting that whatever he needed to share, we could handle together. When I arrived at the cafe, Marcus was already seated at a corner table, looking more serious and subdued than I had seen him in years. As I approached, he stood to hug me, and I was struck by how thin he felt, how tired he looked around his eyes. "Thank you for coming," he said as we settled into our seats. "I wasn't sure you would want to see me after how I've been treating you." The acknowledgement of his behavior was unexpected and encouraging, but I resisted the urge to immediately reassure him or minimize his actions. Instead, I waited for him to continue, giving him space to express whatever had prompted this meeting. Marcus fidgeted with his coffee cup for several moments before looking up at me directly. "Mom, I need to tell you something that I should have shared a long time ago. I've been dealing with some problems that I didn't know how to handle, and I think I've been taking my frustration out on you unfairly." My first impulse was to tell him that whatever was wrong, we could fix it together, that I was here to help and support him through any difficulty. But Dr. Hernandez's voice echoed in my mind, reminding me that my role was to listen and trust rather than to immediately assume responsibility for solving his problems. "I'm listening," I said gently. Marcus took a deep breath, then began to speak in a rush as if he needed to get the words out before he lost his nerve. "I've been having panic attacks for about 8 months now. They started small, just occasional anxiety about work presentations or social situations, but they've gotten progressively worse. Sometimes I can't breathe, my heart races, I feel like I'm going to die." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My son had been suffering from panic attacks for 8 months, and I had been completely unaware. All my vigilance, all my worry, all my attempts to anticipate and prevent his problems, and I had missed something this significant happening in his daily life. "I've been seeing a therapist," Marcus continued, "and taking medication to help manage the symptoms. But the whole experience has been really isolating and scary, and I think I've been pushing people away because I didn't know how to explain what was happening." I felt tears forming in my eyes, not just from sadness about his suffering, but from a complex mixture of emotions I struggled to untangle. Relief that he was getting professional help, hurt that he hadn't felt comfortable sharing this with me, guilt that my worry about his external circumstances had somehow missed his internal struggles. "Marcus," I said softly, "I'm so sorry you've been going through this alone. Thank you for trusting me with this information." He looked surprised by my response, as if he had expected something different. "You're not going to ask a million questions about my treatment, or want to call my therapist or research panic disorder. Online?" The question made me realize how predictable my previous responses had been. how Marcus had learned to expect me to immediately take charge of any problem he shared. "Would you like me to do those things?" I asked instead. Marcus shook his head slowly. "Actually, no. Dr. Kim, my therapist, has been helping me understand that part of managing my anxiety involves learning to handle problems independently rather than immediately seeking rescue from other people." The word rescue stung, but I recognized the truth in it. How many times had I swooped in to solve problems that Marcus could have handled himself, robbing him of opportunities to build confidence in his own problem-solving abilities? He also helped me realize, Marcus continued, that some of my anxiety might be related to feeling like I never learned how to handle difficulties on my own. Like whenever something went wrong or seemed challenging, you were always there with a solution, before I had to figure things out myself. The observation was delivered without malice, but it landed heavily nonetheless. Marcus was telling me that my loving protection had inadvertently contributed to his current struggles with anxiety and independence. "I'm not blaming you," he added, quickly, perhaps seeing the impact of his words on my face. "Dr. Kim says this is a common pattern, especially in single-parent families where one parent feels responsible for everything. You were doing what you thought was best for me." I sat quietly for several minutes, processing this new understanding of our relationship dynamic. The irony was profound and painful. My constant worry about Marcus's well-being had potentially contributed to creating the very anxiety and insecurity I had been trying to prevent. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "The things I said to you that day at lunch were cruel and unfair. You didn't deserve that, regardless of whatever issues I was dealing with." The apology felt genuine and important, but I found myself less focused on receiving it than on understanding the bigger picture of what had led to our conflict. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "But I think I also need to apologize for not recognizing that my involvement in your life had become excessive and potentially harmful." Marcus looked relieved by my acknowledgement. Dr. Kim suggested that we might benefit from a few joint sessions to work on establishing healthier communication patterns. Would you be open to that? The request represented a significant shift from Marcus expecting me to fix his problems to him proposing a collaborative approach to improving our relationship. I felt a surge of pride in his maturity and initiative, followed immediately by gratitude that he still wanted to work on our connection despite the recent strain. "I would very much like that," I said. "I've actually been working with a therapist myself to understand better boundaries in adult parent-child relationships." Marcus's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Really? You've been seeing a therapist?" I nodded. "Dr. Patricia Hernandez. She's been helping me recognize patterns in our relationship that I hadn't seen before." For the first time in months, Marcus smiled. Genuinely. "Look at us, both in therapy, trying to figure out how to have a healthy relationship. Dad would probably find this hilarious." The reference to Roberto didn't sting the way it had during our confrontation. Instead, I found myself thinking that Roberto's approach of simply walking away when relationships became complex was far less mature than Marcus's willingness to do the difficult work of understanding and improving our connection. Over the following weeks, Marcus and I began meeting with Dr. Kim for joint sessions focused on rebuilding our relationship with healthier boundaries and communication patterns. The process was sometimes uncomfortable, as it required both of us to examine and change deeply ingrained habits. Dr. Kim helped me understand that my worry, while well-intentioned, had often prevented Marcus from developing confidence in his own judgment and problem-solving abilities. She also helped Marcus recognize that his recent rejection of my concern had been partly a delayed adolescent rebellion against the overwhelming nature of my involvement in his life. "The goal," Dr. Kim explained during one of our sessions, "isn't for Catherine to stop caring about Marcus or for Marcus to become completely independent of family support. It's to find a balance where Catherine's care doesn't undermine Marcus's autonomy and Marcus's independence doesn't require rejecting his mother's love." The work was gradual and required consistent effort from both of us. I had to learn to tolerate the anxiety of not knowing every detail of Marcus's daily life, while Marcus had to learn to tolerate receiving care and support without feeling overwhelmed or controlled. One significant breakthrough came when Marcus shared that he had been struggling with a difficult project at work. In the past, I would have immediately offered advice, suggestions, and emotional management. Instead, I listened to his concerns and then asked, "How do you think you want to handle this situation?" Marcus thought for a moment, then began outlining a strategy he had been considering. As he spoke, I could see him gaining confidence in his own analysis and problem-solving approach. When he finished, I told him his plan sounded thoughtful and well-reasoned, and that I had confidence in his ability to implement it successfully. "That felt really different," Marcus commented. "Like you trusted me to figure things out rather than needing to protect me from making mistakes." The observation helped me understand a crucial distinction I had never recognized before. True support sometimes means expressing confidence in someone's capabilities rather than assuming responsibility for their outcomes. As our relationship began to stabilize in this new dynamic, I started noticing changes in other areas of my life as well. The mental energy I had previously devoted to managing Marcus's life was now available for my own goals and interests. I reconnected with friendships that had been neglected during my years of intense focus on Marcus. My colleague Diana and I began taking weekend hiking trips, exploring trails throughout Southern California. I joined a book club at the local library, rediscovering my love of literature that had been dormant since my college years. Most surprisingly, I found myself open to the possibility of romantic relationships for the first time since Roberto had left. A fellow teacher named David Chen had been asking me to coffee for months, and I had always declined, feeling too busy and distracted by my responsibilities to Marcus. When he asked again in late spring, I surprised both of us by accepting. David was kind, intelligent, and refreshingly uncomplicated in his approach to relationships. He was divorced with 2 adult children who lived independent lives, and he understood the challenge of transitioning from active parenting to supportive presence. Our conversations were easy and engaging, covering topics that had nothing to do with children or family obligations. On our 3rd date, David made an observation that resonated deeply with me. "You know what I find attractive about you, Catherine? You're present when we're together. You're not constantly distracted by other responsibilities or mentally managing someone else's life." The comment made me realize how much I had changed in the months since my confrontation with Marcus. The constant background anxiety that had characterized my mental state for decades had diminished significantly, replaced by a calmer presence that allowed me to engage more fully with my own experiences. When I shared news of my dating relationship with Marcus during one of our weekly phone calls, he responded with genuine enthusiasm that surprised me. "I'm really happy for you, Mom," he said. "You deserve to have someone in your life who appreciates you. And honestly, it's kind of a relief to know that you have other sources of support and companionship, rather than depending on me for all your social and emotional needs." The conversation represented a level of mature insight from Marcus that I might not have recognized or appreciated during my years of intense involvement in his life. He was thinking about my well-being as a separate person rather than simply as his mother, demonstrating the kind of reciprocal care that characterizes healthy adult relationships. During the summer, Marcus made a decision that would have previously triggered intense anxiety and intervention from me. He accepted a job offer with a startup company in Austin, Texas, that represented a significant career advancement, but also meant moving away from California. When he called to tell me about the opportunity, I felt the familiar surge of worry rising in my chest. Texas was far from California. I didn't know anything about Austin or the company or the people Marcus would be working with. There were countless potential problems and challenges that I couldn't anticipate or help him prepare for. But instead of voicing these concerns or launching into research mode, I took a deep breath and focused on Marcus's excitement and confidence about the opportunity. He had clearly thought through the decision carefully, weighing the professional benefits against the personal costs of relocating. "Congratulations," I said, meaning it sincerely. "It sounds like an excellent opportunity for your career growth." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said, "Thank you, Mom. I was worried you might be upset about me moving so far away." "I'll miss having you nearby," I admitted. "But I'm proud of you for pursuing opportunities that align with your goals, even when they require significant changes." The conversation represented a profound shift in my approach to Marcus's life decisions. Instead of focusing on potential problems or my own discomfort with his choices, I was able to prioritize his autonomy and express confidence in his judgment. As Marcus prepared for his move to Austin, I found myself in the unexpected position of offering practical support without emotional overwhelm. I helped him research moving companies and neighborhoods without taking over the entire process. Offered to help with packing without assuming responsibility for organizing his entire relocation. The night before Marcus's departure, we had dinner at my favorite restaurant in Riverside. The conversation was relaxed and warm, covering his excitement about the new job, my developing relationship with David, and our mutual appreciation for how much our relationship had improved over the past months. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said as we finished dessert. "The panic attacks I was having, they've significantly decreased since we started working on our relationship. Dr. Kim thinks that learning to handle problems independently rather than automatically seeking rescue has helped me develop confidence in my own capabilities." The revelation was both gratifying and humbling. My stepping back from my protective role hadn't just improved our relationship. It had contributed to Marcus's emotional and psychological well-being in ways I never could have anticipated. "I'm proud of the work you've done to address the anxiety," I said. "And I'm grateful that we were both willing to examine and change patterns that weren't serving us well." Marcus reached across the table and took my hand. "I love you, Mom. I know. I didn't always act like it during those months when I was struggling, but your care and support have meant everything to me. I just needed to learn how to receive it in a way that didn't make me feel incompetent." The distinction he drew was crucial and helped me understand the difference between caring that empowers and caring that diminishes. True love sometimes requires trusting people to handle their own challenges rather than assuming they need rescue or protection. As I drove home from dinner that night, I reflected on the unexpected journey of the past year. What had begun as a painful confrontation and rejection had evolved into a deeper understanding of healthy love and appropriate boundaries. Marcus's cruel words about my worrying had forced me to examine patterns I might never have questioned otherwise. The irony wasn't lost on me that my son's criticism of my constant worry had led to changes that ultimately reduced both his anxiety and mine. By learning to trust his competence rather than constantly anticipating problems, I had given him space to develop confidence in his own abilities while freeing myself from the exhausting burden of trying to control outcomes beyond my influence. The next morning, I stood in my driveway waving goodbye as Marcus drove away toward his new life in Austin. For the first time in such a situation, I wasn't mentally cataloging potential hazards of his journey or fighting the urge to call every few hours for updates. Instead, I felt a calm confidence that he was capable of handling whatever challenges arose, and that our relationship was strong enough to weather the distance and changes ahead. As his car disappeared around the corner, I realized that my worry for Marcus hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something more sustainable and healthy. I still cared deeply about his well-being, but that care no longer required constant vigilance or intervention. I could love him fully while trusting him completely, and that trust was perhaps the greatest gift I could offer. Walking back into my house, I felt a sense of spaciousness in my life that was both foreign and welcome. The mental energy I had devoted to managing Marcus's life was now available for my own dreams and goals. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for decades had softened into a more manageable concern that didn't dominate my daily experience. I thought about the conversation with David we had planned for that evening, the book club meeting scheduled for the weekend, the hiking trip Diana and I were planning for the following month. My life was fuller and richer than it had been in years, not despite Marcus's independence, but because of it. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection. The caller ID showed Marcus's number, and for a split second, I felt the old familiar surge of worry. Had something gone wrong already? Was he having second thoughts about the move? But when I answered, Marcus's voice was cheerful and confident. "Hey, Mom. I just wanted to let you know I made it safely to my first stop. The drive is going well, and I should reach Austin tomorrow afternoon as planned." "Thank you for letting me know," I said, appreciating his thoughtfulness in providing an update without being asked. "Drive safely, and let me know when you arrive." After hanging up, I smiled at the simple naturalness of the exchange. Marcus had called because he wanted to reassure me, not because he felt obligated to manage my anxiety. I had received the information gratefully without needing additional details or expressions of worry. It was a small moment, but it represented the kind of relationship we were building together, one based on mutual respect, appropriate boundaries, and genuine care that empowered rather than diminished both of us. The journey from my overwhelming worry to this balanced concern had been difficult and sometimes painful, but it had led to something far more valuable than what we had lost. As I settled into my quiet house, I felt grateful for the difficult lessons of the past year and optimistic about the future we were creating together, each of us whole and independent, yet still meaningfully connected. Marcus had been right to challenge my excessive worry, even if his initial approach had been hurtful. And I had been right to take his criticism seriously and work toward change, even though it required fundamentally re-examining my understanding of love and care. The greatest irony of all was that by worrying less about Marcus, I had become a better mother to him. And by demanding less of my care, he had allowed me to give it more freely and authentically. We had both learned that true love sometimes requires letting go, and that the strongest relationships are built on trust rather than control. 6 months after Marcus moved to Austin, I received an unexpected phone call that would test everything. I had learned about healthy boundaries and appropriate worry. It was a Tuesday evening in November, and I was preparing dinner when my phone rang with an unfamiliar Texas number. "Is this Catherine Martinez?" asked a professional-sounding woman's voice. "Yes, this is Catherine," I replied, immediately feeling my pulse quicken despite my months of practicing anxiety management techniques. "This is Dr. Sarah Williams calling from Del Seaton Medical Center in Austin. I'm calling about your son. Marcus Martinez. He's been in an accident and is currently in our emergency department." The world seemed to tilt sideways as the words penetrated my consciousness. Every instinct I had developed over 30 years of motherhood screamed at me to demand immediate details, to book the first flight to Austin, to take control of the situation, and ensure Marcus received the best possible care. But before I could launch into my familiar pattern of crisis management, I forced myself to take a deep breath and ask simply, "Is he conscious? Can he speak?" "Yes, he's conscious. And alert," Dr. Williams assured me. "He has a concussion and some bruised ribs from a car accident, but his vital signs are stable. He specifically asked me to call you and let you know he's okay, but that you shouldn't worry unnecessarily." Even in his injured state, Marcus was trying to manage my anxiety response. The realization was both touching and illuminating, showing how well he had come to understand both my tendencies and his own needs for space during difficult situations. "Can I speak with him?" I asked. "Certainly. He's been asking for you." When Marcus's voice came through the phone, slightly hoarse but unmistakably himself, I felt relief wash over me like a physical force. "Hi, Mom. he said, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. I'm okay, I promise. Some idiot ran a red light and hit the side of my car, but it looks worse than it is. My first impulse was to flood him with questions about the details of the accident, the quality of his medical care, his pain levels, and his immediate needs. Instead, I found myself asking, "What do you need from me right now?" The question seemed to surprise Marcus, and there was a pause before he answered. Honestly, just knowing that you know what happened and that you're not freaking out is helpful. I have good insurance, the doctors here are competent, and my coworker Jake is here to drive me home when they discharge me. In the past, such an answer would have triggered intense frustration that Marcus didn't want my immediate presence and assistance. Now I recognized it as evidence of his growing confidence in handling crisis situations independently. I'm proud of how you're managing this, I told him, meaning it completely. Will you call me tomorrow to let me know how you're feeling? I will, Marcus promised. And Mom, thank you for not jumping on the first plane to Austin. 6 months ago, you would have been here before I got out of the ER, and honestly, that would have made everything more stressful for me. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, marveling at how different my response had been from what it would have been a year earlier. The worry was still there, but it was manageable, bounded by trust in Marcus's competence and respect for his autonomy. I had managed to be supportive without being overwhelming, caring without being controlling. The next evening, Marcus called as promised to update me on his recovery. He sounded much better, reporting that his headache was improving and that he was planning to return to work the following day with modified duties. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, he said, about how different it felt to have you respond to my crisis with support rather than panic. It made me realize how much our relationship has changed this year. How so? I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Marcus was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. I think for most of my life, I experienced your worry as evidence that you didn't trust me to handle things. Like, if you were constantly anticipating problems and preparing solutions, it meant you thought I was incompetent or fragile. The observation stung because it contained a grain of uncomfortable truth. Had my protective instinct sometimes communicated doubt rather than love? But yesterday, Marcus continued, when you asked what I needed, instead of telling me what you thought I should do, it felt like you trusted me to know my own situation and make good decisions about it. That was really powerful for me. I felt tears forming in my eyes, not from sadness, but from a complex mixture of pride, gratitude, and relief. The work we had both done to rebuild our relationship was bearing fruit in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. I'm learning to trust your competence, I said. It's not always easy, because my protective instincts are still strong, but I'm understanding that trust is actually a deeper form of love than control. 2 weeks later, I received another call from Marcus that would provide an even greater test of my newfound approach to our relationship. Mom, he said, his voice bubbling with excitement. I have some big news. Emma and I are engaged. The announcement hit me like a thunderbolt. Emma, the woman whose judgment of my relationship with Marcus had contributed to our crisis a year earlier, was now going to become my daughter-in-law. My immediate impulse was to express concerns about the speed of their relationship, to question whether they had adequately addressed the issues that had led to their previous breakup, to insert myself into their wedding planning process. Instead, I took a breath and said, Congratulations, Marcus. You sound very happy. I am, he said. We both are. We've done a lot of work on our relationship over the past year, including couples counseling, and we feel ready to make this commitment. The mention of couples counseling surprised me, as Marcus hadn't shared that he and Emma were working with a therapist. In the past, I would have felt hurt by being excluded from such significant information about his life. Now I recognized it as appropriate boundary setting on his part. That sounds like a mature approach to preparing for marriage, I said. When are you thinking of having the wedding? Next summer, probably July or August. We want to have the ceremony here in Austin, since most of our friends are here now, but we definitely want you to be involved in the planning process. The invitation to involvement felt different from Marcus's previous requests for my help. Rather than expecting me to take charge and solve problems, he was offering me the opportunity to participate in a way that respected both my importance to him and his autonomy as an adult. Over the following months, I had numerous opportunities to practice the boundary skills I had developed as Marcus and Emma planned their wedding. When they asked for my input on venues, I offered thoughts and suggestions without researching every option myself or taking over the decision-making process. When they encountered budgeting challenges, I listened supportively without immediately offering financial solutions. The most significant test came when Emma called me directly in early spring to discuss an issue with their wedding planning. I was surprised to hear from her, as we had maintained polite but distant contact since Marcus's move to Austin. "Catherine," she said, "I hope it's okay that I'm calling you directly. Marcus suggested I reach out because he thought you might have some helpful perspective on something we're dealing with." "Of course," I said, curious about what had prompted this unprecedented direct communication. Emma explained that they were struggling with guest list decisions, particularly around Marcus's father, Roberto, who had recently reached out expressing interest in attending the wedding despite having had minimal contact with Marcus for over 20 years. "Marcus is conflicted," Emma said. "Part of him wants his father there, but he's also angry about all the years of absence and worried about drama at the wedding. He values your opinion but doesn't want to put you in an uncomfortable position by asking directly." The situation was emotionally complex, involving my own painful history with Roberto and my protective instincts toward Marcus. My first impulse was to advise against including Roberto, to shield Marcus from potential disappointment and hurt. But as Emma spoke, I realized that this was exactly the kind of situation where Marcus needed to make his own decision based on his own values and needs, not my emotional reactions to his father. "This is really Marcus's decision to make," I said carefully. "I can share my perspective if it would be helpful, but ultimately, he needs to choose what feels right for him and your marriage." Emma was quiet for a moment, then said, "Actually, that response is exactly what Marcus said you would say. He's been telling me how much you've changed over the past year, how you've learned to support him without trying to control his decisions." The conversation with Emma marked a turning point in our relationship as well. She began reaching out, periodically to share wedding planning updates and ask for advice, not because she needed me to solve problems, but because she valued my perspective and experience. During one of these conversations, Emma made an observation that completely recontextualized our past conflicts. "Catherine," she said, "I owe you an apology for some things I said about your relationship with Marcus last year. I was young and immature, and I didn't understand the difference between a mother who's overly involved because she's controlling and a mother who's overly involved because she loves deeply but hasn't learned healthy boundaries." The distinction she drew was profound and helped me understand that my intentions had been good even when my methods were problematic. "You were protecting your relationship with Marcus," I said. "I understand that, and I don't hold any resentment about it. The thing is," Emma continued, "watching you change this year, seeing how you've learned to love Marcus in a way that empowers rather than diminishes him, has actually made me excited about having you as a mother-in-law. You're not the same person who made me feel like I could never measure up to your standards of care for Marcus." Her words brought tears to my eyes, representing a level of acceptance and appreciation I had never expected to receive from Emma. More importantly, they confirmed that my growth had been visible and meaningful to the people around me. As summer approached and the wedding drew near, I found myself in the unexpected position of being genuinely excited about the celebration rather than anxious about my role in it. Marcus and Emma had created a beautiful event that reflected their personalities and values, and my contribution had been supportive rather than directive. The week before the wedding, I flew to Austin and stayed with Marcus and Emma in their apartment. The experience of being a houseguest in my son's home rather than an authority figure managing his life felt strange, but wonderful. We spent time cooking together, exploring Austin's neighborhoods, and having conversations that flowed naturally between topics rather than being dominated by my questions about his well-being. On the morning of the wedding, as I helped Emma with final preparations, she pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Catherine," she said, "I need to tell you something. Marcus has been planning to say this in his wedding speech, but I wanted you to hear it first. He's been telling people that the best thing that ever happened to our relationship was you learning to love him differently." I felt my throat tighten with emotion as Emma continued. "He says that watching you grow and change this year taught him what he wants our marriage to look like. How to support each other without trying to control each other. How to care deeply without losing yourselves in the process." The wedding ceremony was beautiful, held in a botanical garden with close friends and family gathered under the Texas summer sky. As I watched Marcus and Emma exchange vows, I felt a deep sense of peace and gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. Roberto had ultimately decided not to attend the wedding, a choice that Marcus had made peace with through his own therapy and reflection. His absence didn't diminish the joy of the day or create the drama we had all worried about. During the reception, Marcus gave a speech thanking the important people in his life. When he reached the section about me, his words were both surprising and deeply moving. "My mom, Catherine, taught me what love looks like," he said, "but not in the way you might expect. She taught me that real love sometimes means stepping back rather than stepping in. Real love means trusting people to handle their own challenges rather than assuming they need rescue. Real love empowers rather than controls." He paused, looking directly at me across the reception space. "Mom, thank you for loving me enough to let me grow up, even when it was scary for you. Thank you for showing me that the strongest relationships are built on trust rather than fear. And thank you for becoming the person you were meant to be, not just the mother you thought I needed." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, but what moved me most was the expression on Marcus's face as he spoke. There was no resentment, no hidden criticism, just genuine appreciation for the woman I had become and the relationship we had built together. Later that evening, as the reception was winding down, David, who had traveled to Austin as my guest, pulled me onto the dance floor for one final song. "You should be proud of yourself," he said as we swayed to the music. "The relationship you and Marcus have now is something special." "It wasn't easy to get here," I admitted. "There were times when I wasn't sure we'd be able to rebuild what we had damaged." David smiled. "Sometimes the strongest structures are the ones that have been torn down and rebuilt with better materials. You and Marcus didn't just repair your relationship, you created something entirely new and better." As the evening ended and Marcus and Emma prepared to leave for their honeymoon, Marcus approached me for a final goodbye. The hug he gave me was warm and lingering, without the tension or obligation that had characterized our physical affection during our difficult period. "Thank you for everything, Mom," he said softly. "For raising me, for supporting me, for learning to trust me, and for becoming such an amazing example of what it means to keep growing throughout your life." Flying home to California the next day, I reflected on the incredible transformation our relationship had undergone in less than 2 years. What had begun with Marcus's cruel assessment of my worry had evolved into a deeper, more authentic connection based on mutual respect and appropriate boundaries. The irony was that by worrying less about Marcus, I had become more effective at supporting him. By trusting his competence rather than anticipating his failures, I had given him space to develop confidence in his own abilities. By focusing on my own growth and happiness, I had become a more interesting and balanced person for him to have a relationship with. Back in Riverside, I settled into a life that was fuller and more satisfying than I had ever imagined possible. My relationship with David had deepened into a loving partnership built on shared interests and mutual respect. My friendships with Diana and other colleagues had blossomed now that I was emotionally available for reciprocal support and companionship. Most surprisingly, I had discovered talents and interests that had been dormant for decades. I had started painting again, something I hadn't done since college, and found genuine joy in the creative process. I had begun writing, first in the journal Dr. Hernandez had suggested, then branching out into short stories that explored themes of family, growth, and the complexities of love. My teaching had also improved, as the emotional skills I had developed in therapy translated into better relationships with my students and their parents. I was more able to support struggling children without taking over their problems, to encourage worried parents without amplifying their anxiety. 1 year after Marcus's wedding, I received news that would provide the ultimate test of how much our relationship had truly changed. Marcus called to tell me that he and Emma were expecting their first child. "We're due in the spring," he said, excitement and nervousness evident in his voice. "We wanted you to be among the first to know." My immediate impulse was to flood him with advice about pregnancy, parenting, and the countless decisions they would need to make over the coming months. I wanted to research pediatricians in Austin, send books about child development, and begin planning how I could support them during this major life transition. Instead, I simply said, "Congratulations, Marcus. You and Emma are going to be wonderful parents." "Thank you," he said, then added with a laugh, "I have to admit, I'm a little terrified about becoming responsible for someone else's well-being. I keep thinking about all the ways I could mess up or fail to protect them from harm." The comment was deeply ironic, given our history, and I recognized an opportunity to share what I had learned about the difference between healthy and unhealthy worry. "That anxiety is normal," I said gently. "Every parent worries about their child's well-being. The key is learning to channel that concern in ways that support your child's development rather than undermining it." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said, "I guess I'll be learning what you went through when I was growing up. How to love someone so much that their safety and happiness feel more important than your own." "Yes," I agreed. "But you'll also have the advantage of understanding from the beginning that your child needs to develop confidence in their own abilities. You won't have to unlearn the patterns I had to work so hard to change." Over the following months, I was able to watch Marcus and Emma navigate pregnancy with the kind of balanced approach I wished I had been able to model when Marcus was young. They researched and prepared thoughtfully without becoming consumed by anxiety. They made decisions based on their own values rather than others' expectations. They asked for support when they needed it without expecting others to solve their problems. When my granddaughter Sophia was born in April, I flew to Austin to meet her and help during the first week of her life. The experience of being a supportive presence without being a controlling force was revelatory. I was able to offer practical help with cooking and cleaning while respecting Marcus and Emma's autonomy as parents. Most importantly, I was able to hold Sophia and feel pure joy in her existence without immediately beginning to worry about all the potential hazards and challenges she would face throughout her life. The anxiety was there, but it was manageable, bounded by trust in her parents' competence and my own understanding of healthy boundaries. On my last day in Austin, as I prepared to return to California, Marcus pulled me aside for a conversation that felt like the culmination of our entire journey together. "Mom," he said, "I want to tell you something important. Watching you this week, seeing how you've interacted with Sophia and supported Emma and me, has been incredible. You've been present and helpful without being overwhelming. You've shown love without trying to control." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I realize now that your worry when I was growing up came from the deepest kind of love. You wanted to protect me from every possible harm, and that instinct was beautiful even when the expression of it became problematic. But watching you now, I see what love looks like when it's balanced with trust and respect for autonomy. Marcus took a breath, then continued with words that would stay with me forever. I want to be the kind of parent to Sophia that you've become to me. Someone who loves deeply but trusts completely. Someone who supports without controlling, who cares without overwhelming. You've shown me what that looks like, and it's the greatest gift you could have given me as I start this journey of parenthood. Flying home that day, I felt a sense of completion that was both satisfying and bittersweet. The relationship I had with Marcus now was everything I had wanted it to be when he was growing up, but it had required letting go of almost everything I thought I knew about love and motherhood. The journey from overwhelming worry to balanced concern had been difficult and sometimes painful, but it had led to connections and experiences I never could have imagined. Marcus was now a confident, capable adult who chose to include me in his life because he valued my presence, not because he felt obligated by guilt or dependence. More importantly, I had discovered who Catherine Martinez was beyond her role as Marcus's mother. I was a woman capable of growth, change, and new beginnings even in my 50s. I was someone worthy of love and respect in my own right, not just as a caregiver and problem solver for others. The greatest irony of all was that Marcus's cruel comment about my constant worry had been the catalyst for positive changes none of us could have predicted. His rejection of my overwhelming concern had forced me to examine patterns that needed changing, leading to a deeper and more authentic relationship between us. Today, as I write this story, Marcus calls me once a week to share updates about his life and Sophia's development. Our conversations are warm and genuine, covering everything from his work challenges to Sophia's latest milestones, to my own adventures with David and my painting classes. When Marcus does encounter problems or difficult decisions, he sometimes asks for my perspective, but he no longer expects me to provide solutions or manage his emotions around challenges. I offer support and encouragement while trusting his ability to navigate his own life. The worry is still there, because love always carries an element of concern for others' well-being, but it's no longer the driving force of our relationship or the defining characteristic of my daily experience. I can care deeply about Marcus and Sophia without feeling responsible for controlling their outcomes or preventing their difficulties. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Marcus had never challenged my constant worry, if we had continued in our old patterns without ever examining their impact on both our lives. I think we would have maintained the surface appearance of closeness while gradually growing more distant and resentful. Instead, his harsh but necessary words forced us both to grow in ways that ultimately strengthened our connection and improved our individual well-being. He learned to trust his own competence and to receive love without feeling controlled. I learned to express care without overwhelming others and to find value in my own life beyond my role as his mother. The relationship we have now is built on a foundation of mutual respect, appropriate boundaries, and genuine affection. It's what I always wanted our connection to be, but I had to completely reimagine what love looks like to achieve it. Marcus was right when he said I was always worrying, but he was wrong about what the solution needed to be. The answer wasn't for me to stop caring about his well-being. It was for me to learn to express that care in ways that empowered rather than diminished him. And perhaps most importantly, he should have worried about how he was treating me, because healthy relationships require reciprocal respect and consideration. The changes we made benefited both of us, creating space for authentic connection and mutual support. As I look toward the future, I feel optimistic about the continued evolution of our relationship. Marcus and Emma are planning to visit California this summer so Sophia can spend time with her West Coast family. David and I are discussing the possibility of relocating to Austin in a few years to be closer to our children and grandchildren. But whatever changes come, I'm confident that the foundation we've built will support us through the transitions. We've learned to love each other as we actually are rather than as we think we should be. And that authenticity has created something far more valuable than the controlling dynamic we used to maintain. My son complained that I was always worrying, and he was absolutely right. But through the painful process of examining and changing that pattern, we both discovered what it means to love someone fully while respecting their autonomy completely. And that discovery has made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.